Only 20 years after America's involvement in World War I, it was again faced with the threat of war, with the violent German and Japanese expansion. America was recovering from a devastating depression. At the same time, the size of the United States military was at an all-time low. American citizens began to swap their tools of trade for weapons of war. In the dawn of unprecedented warfare, training and technology had to be brought up to speed, fast. Despite the hard work ahead, much of the training was grounded in unparalleled resourcefulness and determination. Like any war, specialty units would be needed. Soldiers trained in explosives, hand-to-hand combat, and airborne attacks. Americans willing to go above and beyond the call to duty. Great Britain was the only remaining Allied power free from Germany's relentless expansion. They pressured the U.S. into supplying vast amounts of military support. Americans were torn over U.S. involvement in another war. They were reluctant to send their boys off to die in foreign lands.
I just knew that war was crazy. So while I was in high school, I decided that we can't have another war. In fact, I even considered myself a pacifist.
Francis may not have believed in war, but world events and his own strong personal convictions would eventually place him in a military uniform.
After Hitler invaded Poland, when it became a fait accompli, I said, oh boy, this is getting serious now. So it didn't take me very long to change my tune. My whole idea, my whole perspective went from being a pacifist to being one who's ready to go in and fight. I was ready to go over there and become a mercenary, so to speak, but I was still kind of young, you know. In 1939, I was 19 years old. And all of my buddies were going into the Air Corps. They were becoming flying cadets. They were going to learn to fly airplanes. So I said, well, why not? So I get up there, the flight surgeon, you know, he's checking me all over, and then the next thing you know, he brings me into this room. There's a machine, and there's some levers, and he says, okay, match these things up. So I'm going like this, you know, and there's two sticks down there in a box somewhere, and I'm trying to put these two sticks together. So, well, I was kind of leery about what was going on here. So after he called me into his office, he said, oh, Mr. Lamoureux, he says, you know, he says, you'd be a fine candidate as a flying cadet. Mentally, your intelligence, you've passed everything with flying colors. He says, there's only one thing. If I were to pass you now and give you the okay to go ahead and learn to become a pilot, he says, someday you'd be flying in and you'd see the runway, and you come down, and all of a sudden you'd see two runways, you wouldn't know which one to take. He says, we can't have you for that reason. So, I was crushed.
Unable to become a pilot due to poor eyesight, Francis worked for American Bosch in Springfield, Massachusetts, overseeing the manufacturing of supplies for the impending wartime effort.
I was in a war industry. We were producing stuff. We still weren't at war, but I had a deferment because the draft had come along, and he said, well, we can't draft this guy because he's too important. He's done a very important job to help prepare for the defense of this country. I decided that wasn't enough. I says, I'm not going to sit the war out here, because I felt so strongly that I could do something. I wanted to do something. All my pals I went to high school with, they were either becoming pilots or they were going in to the military in the Navy or something like this. So I decided, well, I'm going to go in the Army. So I signed up November 3rd, 1941.
On December 7th, 1941, over 300 Japanese bombers attacked U.S. naval forces at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. On December 8th, President Franklin Roosevelt called on Congress to declare war, committing our troops to the Allied forces.
I did the right thing. We knew it was inevitable, and I knew it was, and I accepted the fact that we were at war.
The following year, Francis taught recruits at Aberdeen, Maryland, but it still wasn't enough.
Almost a year after the day that I went down to Aberdeen, I walked into the company clerk's office, and I looked on the bulletin board, and I was just checking over to see what they were advertising up there, and I saw an announcement that they were looking for volunteers for parachute duty.
This would be the second time Francis volunteered within the U.S. Armed Forces.
I looked at the company clerk. I said, sign me up. I want to go. And he looked at me. He said, Lamoureux, are you crazy? You want to leave this spot? This was a country club, you know. We were living the life of Riley at Aberdeen. I said, no, I want to become a paratrooper.
He spent 4 intense weeks at Fort Benning, Georgia, under the auspices of then Major Lou Mendez.
After the 3rd or 4th day, I could hardly move. I thought I was an old man. I felt like I didn't have a muscle left in my body. I was creaking. It was absolute agony just to get out of bed and to go through it. But of course, some of the guys were just they were dropping like flies. It was too much for them. They couldn't take it. They were going bananas. They said, this is too much. They said, this is what I came in the Army for. I said, this is what I came in for. I wanted to learn how to become a soldier, how to become a paratrooper, to get it there fighting tough, get toughened up.
The use of paratroopers was not new to the enemy. The Germans had effectively used airborne insertion in the remarkable attack at Ebon-Imal in Belgium and in the invasion of Crete. But for Americans, this was an unprecedented unit that required unique warriors.
They had the towers, we had the 250-foot drop, we had the mock-ups of airplanes, and we had all these little harnesses, and we'd have to jump off towers, you know, get the feeling of falling into space and how to hit the ground. But we were learning all the techniques of jumping out of an airplane, landing so you wouldn't break an ankle or wouldn't break an arm or break a leg, and how to absorb the shock and roll over.
Their training included severe tests of endurance, evasive tactics, and of course, jump procedures.
All this time we're learning how to pack parachutes. So we're down in this huge shed with these great big long tables, you know, great big hangars. And so here you are, they're teaching you how to hang a chute. You have the shot bags, and you have to do this, go this forward, you know, to go through all the motions of folding. And everyone's watching every move you make. And if you make a bad move, next thing you know, 50 push-ups. Give me 50. Get down there. Give me 50. Or else they give you the beanbags. Run around. And you have to run all the way around. You have to holler, I won't do this again. I won't do this again. You know, it was this discipline.
This innovative training marked an important development in U.S. military history. These men were predecessors to U.S. Army Special Operation units that would include U.S. Army Rangers, U.S. Navy SEALs, and the U.S. Army Special Forces, the Green Beret.
We had one officer who was our battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Luis G. Mendez. He was a Mexican, and he had graduated from West Point. And he was one hell of a soldier and one hell of a man, because when we got into combat, when we got into Normandy, and we're on the ground and we're fighting again as a unit, and we see Colonel Mendez face to face with him, and then we remember, this is what he was doing. He was getting us ready for this.
But for Francis and 100 other volunteer soldiers, the training under harsh conditions and with limited resources was by no means special.
One of the jumps I'll never forget, what we made down at McCall, where we're on the field. I just jumped, and then another wave came over, and when that wave came over, I looked over, and there's this coming down. His chute wrapped around him, never opened. He came all the way down, hit the ground, bounced. I'd never seen a guy hit the ground without his parachute open. You know? And this one, he was wrapped up, just like a cocoon.
After finishing jump school, Francis joined the 508th Regiment, which was stationed in Northern Ireland. Shortly thereafter, he joined a secret mission involving an upcoming operation. It was a mission strictly reserved for 3-time volunteers.
They started to brief us while we were there. We had the aerial photographs, we had the maps, we had the mock-ups. Finally, we knew we were going to land in France.
Francis Lamoureux was about to become part of the largest amphibious invasion in the history of the world. An attack so complex, it required the efforts and participation of every military branch from each of the Allied countries.
We were warned, if you try to get out of here, you're going to get shot. We had armed guards around us to prevent us. You couldn't escape. There was no way we were going to get the word out that we were going to jump in Normandy. You know?
On June 5th, 1944, Francis and 17 other paratroopers would conduct a midnight drop into Normandy, setting up beacons for 2 large waves of airborne attacks. They were called the Pathfinders.
We finally get the order, we're going to get on the backs of these trucks. So we're in the back of the trucks and we're heading towards the airfield where we're going toward the planes. And on the way, some of our paratrooper buddies, they were really pretty well hopped up. But they knew we're finally going to get the war. They took their grenades, their pins, they threw them out in the field. The grenades were exploding all over the place. They were wild. They were a wild bunch, I'll tell you.
For the Pathfinders, a major concern had been the extra weight that had been added before they jumped.
You got your reserve chute, you got a Mae West, you got your knife, grenades, bandoliers of ammunition. We must have had about 70, I must have had at least 75, 80 pounds on top of me because I was carrying the radar set as well as all the other combat gear that I had on.
Francis was fourth in line to jump between Fayette O. Richardson and Captain William Medford. He and the other Pathfinders were responsible for setting up specially created beacons once they reached the ground, while the others, like Ralph Nicholson, were to provide cover.
It was moonlight, the moon was still out. The sky looked pretty good, and then next thing you know, we get the order to stand up and hook up. So here we are, we stand up, we're hooked up, we're waiting. We didn't have anyone on the ground to give us the signal to say, here, this is where you're supposed to jump, boys. There was nobody down there to say, this is your drop zone, this is your DZ. As we looked down and we could see all this stuff looked like fireworks, like Roman candles. And next thing you know, it got noisier and noisier, and our plane kept losing altitude because we were going to jump at about 500 feet. That was supposed to be our limit.
After conducting one final equipment check, the Pathfinders commenced jumping into a moonlit sky filled with the hostile tracers of German ground fire.
As soon as I hit the air, I felt the opening shock. Didn't feel any worse. I thought it was going to be pretty bad because of all the extra equipment we had on. I went into a nice, easy oscillation, and I'm looking around in the darkness. And by the time I got to the fifth oscillation, I was on the ground, right in the middle of an apple orchard. Apple trees all around us, right in the middle.
Francis reached the ground relatively unscathed. Ralph Nicholson was not so lucky.
Right after he'd shoot open, he was hit by small arms fire from the Germans. He was carrying a mine. He had a landmine on him, on top of the rest of his equipment. His landmine got hit. He blew up. He was dead before he hit the ground. So of the 18 men that were in our stick, only 9 of us ever got together on that drop zone.
Overwhelmed by his narrow escape from small arms fire, Francis paused to recap his objective.
Then I started to get up on my feet, but there were tracers going across the field. And we could hear a German personnel carrier. We could hear German voices. And the personnel carrier, outside the field, there's a road, and they were patrolling the road. And next thing you know, all this stuff was flying over our heads. I don't know if they could see us or knew we were there, but we were quiet.
Francis then proceeded to set up his beacon in time for the next wave of jumps.
Our drop zone was designated as DZN, and of course the Morse code for N is dash dot. So that was the signal I had to send. I felt stupid. Here I am sitting here. I'm using my thumb. It wasn't a key. I was the thumb, and I'm pushing my thumb. Dash dot. Wait. Dash dot. Dash dot. I kept doing this for about 15, 20 minutes. Dash dot. Dash dot. Dash dot. I'm going crazy. Dash dot. Dash dot. We're waiting for the planes to come.